Going to discuss the white matter of spinal cord. In the previous lecture about this gray matter of spinal cord, I already discussed what white matter is. I'm going to briefly describe it again. The white matter basically is the collection of axons inside the central nervous system, that is the brain and the spinal cord. So the collection of axons, a bundle of axons inside the CNS is called a tract, T-R-A-C-T, a tract. And combination of multiple tracts is called white matter. In this diagram, I have drawn a cross section or a transverse section of the spinal cord, in which this oval portion is the spinal cord, having gray matter inside in the form of a butterfly and white matter on the peripheries. And this is the spinal nerve attached to it. The spinal nerve is attached to the spinal cord by two roots, an anterior root which comes from the anterior horn of the gray matter and a posterior root which comes from the posterior horn of the gray matter. When both these roots combine, they form a spinal nerve trunk, and as soon as the spinal nerve trunk forms, it divides into two primary branches which are called the primary rami of the spinal nerve. Now coming back to the white matter of the spinal cord is on the peripheries and the gray matter is in the center in the form of an H or a butterfly, whatever you want to call it. Now the white matter is divided into three columns. Now to describe the columns, we will have to draw an imaginary line cutting the spinal cord into two equal halves on right and left side. So this is the imaginary line I have drawn with dotted red, which shows this is the right side and this is the left side. This is the posterior part of the spinal cord and this is the anterior part of the spinal cord. Now, the white matter is divided into three columns, three on right side and three on the left side. Now this division, one is the anterior white column. The anterior white column is between the anterior midline, the imaginary line which we have drawn, and the anterior root of the spinal nerve. So this green portion is the anterior white column or the anterior funiculus of the spinal cord. Then the portion of white matter between the anterior and posterior roots, the portion colored with red, is the lateral white column, and this is also called the lateral funiculus of the spinal cord. Then the portion of the white matter between the posterior midline and the posterior root of the spinal nerve, this portion is called the posterior funiculus or the posterior white column. Now the tracts in this white matter are of two types. Some are ascending and some are descending. By ascending tracts, I mean the tracts which carry information from the peripheries and from receptors and takes it towards the brain. So these tracts are sensory tracts. So ascending tracts carry information towards the higher centers, that is the brain, and they are called ascending or sensory tracts. Then come those tracts which carry information from the brain towards the organs, towards effector organs, which show their effect according to the stimulus coming from the brain. Those are called the descending tracts or the motor tracts. So they carry information from the higher centers towards the effector organs and they perform any kind of function like movement of skeletal muscles or secretion from the glands. So they are called descending tracts. Now in the posterior white column, there are only ascending tracts. There is no descending tract in the posterior white column. The anterior and lateral white column both have ascending and descending tracts. They are mixed in these two regions of the spinal cord. Now I will briefly discuss what this posterior root ganglion is. The posterior root of the spinal nerve has a ganglion in it. As I already discussed in the previous lecture, a ganglion is collection of cell bodies of neurons outside the central nervous system. So this is the central nervous system, the spinal cord, and this is the posterior root which is outside the central nervous system. So a ganglion over here, so a collection of cell bodies of neurons over here will be called a ganglion. Now there are multiple types of neurons, one of which is called the pseudo-unipolar neurons, in which a single cell body has a single process which eventually divides into two parts. The one going towards the receptor becomes the dendrite and the other one going inside the central nervous system becomes the axon. So the posterior root ganglion is formed by neurons which are of pseudo-unipolar type. That means the cell bodies of this type of neurons are located in the posterior root ganglion. I am drawing only one cell body. Obviously there are multiple. Just to explain, I have drawn only one cell body. It has a single process which divides into a peripheral process which leaves the spinal nerve through its branches and joins some receptors on the skin or muscles or anywhere else. The central process comes inside the central nervous system and takes the information from the receptors inside the central nervous system. Now, in the tracts, usually one neuron is not enough to carry the information from the receptor to the brain or from the brain towards the effector organ. So, a chain of neurons is required to carry the information. So, for example, this is an outline of the ascending tracts, and this is for the descending tracts. Now, what are orders of neurons? The first neuron in the chain of neurons, in case of ascending tracts, which carries information from the receptor, is called the first order neuron. And the first order neuron in case of ascending tracts is always present in the posterior root or the dorsal root ganglion of the spinal nerve, which I have already shown you in the previous diagram. Then the first order neuron gives its information or its impulses to the second order neuron, and from the second order neuron it is carried to the third or neuron in the chain of neurons, which is called the third order neuron, and so on if multiple neurons are required. And then eventually the ascending tracts, the information of the ascending tracts reach the brain. Now in case of descending tracts, the first order neuron will carry its impulses from the brain, and they have to reach an effector organ. So the chain of neurons which carry the information from the brain towards an effector organ is called the descending tract. So the first neuron in the chain of neurons is always obviously called the first order neuron, then comes the second order neuron, and then comes the third order, and eventually it goes towards the